I never gave you permission to send out my manuscript to other people. I am done with your journal. And there's you can Google it. And you can find the
can get
letter.
away with
pull
that.
it off.
He can get away with that.
Welcome once again to Free Associations from the Boston University School of Public Health, the Public Health and Medical Journal Club podcast. For anyone who is as confused by the latest health study as I am, by who should still be wearing masks. Okay, I know that I harp on this, but I went into the grocery store the other day, and it was the first time I've been in a store with people who were not wearing masks. And I don't necessarily know that that is problematic, but it feels weird. So I'm curious as to whether you all have had this experience and whether you are finding it as difficult to change your behavior, assuming that we should change our behavior, as I do.
Yeah, I find it really hard to figure out what the etiquette is. Take your cues from your surroundings and whether the person behind the cash register is wearing one or not, and whether other guests or customers are wearing one or not. I mean, I from a scientific standpoint, I feel quite good about not wearing a mask because I've been fully vaccinated, and I feel quite protected, and I don't feel as if I'm substantially a risk. But it's become a real social thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would agree with that. Believe the science. At this point, the only reason to wear a mask in a 7-Eleven is if you're robbing the 7-Eleven.
I'm going to assume
Halloween.
Right.
I assume none of us is doing that, and I assume, Chris, you also mean, of course, if you're vaccinated.
Oh, hypothetically, right? Yes. No. You should. If you're robbing a 7-Eleven, you should definitely be vaccinated. It just stands to reason.
Okay. I'm just going to leave that one right there and move on.
As well as masked.
Yeah,
exactly.
So I am Matt Fox from the Departments of Epidemiology and Global Health here at the BU School of Public Health. And I am joined once again by Dr. Chris Gill from the Department of Global Health. Welcome, Chris.
Hey,
a great pleasure to be here.
That did not help.
I tried to mix it up there.
That was, of course, Don Thea from the Department of Global Health. Welcome, Don.
Hey, Matt.
No, that was Chris. Okay. I occasionally hear from people who tell me that we all sound the same.
One from another.
Yeah, so you doing that has just gone and made it worse.
I think my voice is more mellifluous.
Yeah, you keep telling yourself that, Chris.
I think your voice is more lengthy, Chris.
Lengthy?
Yeah.
Is that like verbaria?
Yeah, exactly. we tend to hear more of it.
Okay.
Oh, well, we could all be so lucky.
Oh, boy. All right, I'm going to just go on to the show because I can't do anything else at this point. So today in our first segment, which is our journal club, we're going to look at a study as to whether the drug MDMA is effective for treating PTSD. And then in the second part of the podcast, which is our deep dive, we'll talk about whether vaccine passports are legal and ethical, at least in the United States. I suppose the ethical nature doesn't change, but the legal nature could. And in our Amazing and Amusing, which is our third segment, we'll get into some things that make us laugh out loud or just blew us away. So let's get into segment one. So we're going to talk about an article that looked at the effectiveness of the drug MDMA to treat PTSD. It was
also known as ecstasy.
I wouldn't know, Don.
No. I've consulted some experts in the field.
I appreciate that. So this article was published in Nature Medicine, and it was titled MDMA Assisted Therapy for Severe PTSD, a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled phase 3 study by first author Jennifer Mitchell of the Department of Neurology at the University of California, San Francisco, out in California. So got a lot of headlines, as you wouldn't be too surprised to learn. Yahoo says MDMA shows promise as severe PTSD treatment. Time magazine says a new study points to MDMA as a powerful treatment for PTSD. BBC News says MDMA could help trauma survivors face painful memories. And ABC News says how MDMA could treat PTSD in ways current therapy can't. So, Chris, can you walk us through this one? Tell us what they did and what they found.
Sure. This was an absolutely fascinating study, I found.
Agree.
I think from just as a prequel, I think that from the perspective of the randomized control trial itself, it was really rather straightforward. They had some interesting study design elements, which I'll describe, but the basic question behind it just sort of made me think really deeply, and it felt like it had some interesting, some contemporary analogs to the recent use of ketamine for treatment of severe depression. So it is basically, we're looking at a sea change in the acceptance or the embracement of the idea that psychedelic medications might have important psychiatric therapeutic effects. I think this is just a really interesting idea, and I'm fascinated to see where this field goes over the coming years and maybe decades. But this was a huge proof of concept in the case of PTSD. So with all that said, let me just remind everyone that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a huge problem amongst individuals who have particularly experienced trauma through violence in combat situations. But of course, it's not unique to combat. It's just that combat is such an obvious way of being traumatized in that way. And what we know about PTSD in terms of what it is at a sort of a neuropathology level is that it has something to do with an accelerated experience of fear, that there are circuits in our brain that appropriately or inappropriately attach a fear to the experience of different things that happen to us, and that these can be, you can have sort of echoes of these events that occur long after the event itself, and that while the precise mechanisms are still pretty unclear, it seemed to me, it seems that the serotonin system plays an important role in this. And that is the reason why, in terms of current treatments, we use drugs like Prozac or Paxil, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, as first-line therapy, psychopharmacological therapy for PTSD. But it also seems to be the case that behavioral therapy, talking therapy, in other words, is also a very important aspect to this. But in both cases, the drug treatments and the therapeutic approach are, at best, only partially successful at improving symptoms of PTSD. And the disease remains chronic and relapsing, and there's a lot of sequelae in terms of disruption of people's lives, a loss of quality of life, and also the risk of suicide. So this is an enormous unmet public health need. Now, the interest in ecstasy, which is technically, it's a methylene dioxymethamphetamine. So it's a stimulant, but it has rather broad effects that tweak the serotonin system as well as the norepinephrine system. And so in a way, you can see that this is a drug that targets the same general system as the Prozac-like drugs do, but it is a much more potent agonist of the serotonin system. And so in mouse models, where I suppose there's some way of creating a PTSD-like trigger in a mouse, you can treat those mice, and when the mice have been treated with MDMA, they de-express their exaggerated fear response subsequently. So in an animal model, it seems that this theory works. And when these mice have been euthanized, you can see that it is, the PTSD mice have, substantial changes in the serotonin systems and parts of their brain, and that these are aligned with changes following the use of a drug like ecstasy. So there's a sort of interesting theoretical basis for this. And then that has led to a number of smallish phase 2 trials, which, when viewed through a meta-analysis, suggested that there was possible therapeutic benefit to that. And so that was the rationale for the current phase 3 trial. And it was a very well done study, I would say. Basically, they screened a large number of individuals who, had experienced PTSD-like symptoms. They selected the ones who had the most severe PTSD, meaning that they scored high on a screening tool called the CAPS-5 tool, and they had to achieve a score of 45 or above, with 35 or above being the sort of established cut point for where you have severe PTSD. So these individuals all had severe and probably very severe PTSD at baseline. And then they randomized them to either be in a group that received a placebo plus therapy or to receive ecstasy, the MDMA, plus therapy. And the way they did this was to first of all, wean all the participants off of any SSRIs that they may have been taking for those who were. And then they initiated them on a series of therapy sessions. And so they went through a number of those sessions. And after they'd completed, I think, their third therapy session, they then randomized them to receive either the placebo or the MDA, and then they continued this for another 3 sessions. So it was 18 weeks beyond the initiation of the medication, and what they were looking for as their endpoint was a significant reduction on the CAPS-5 scale. And then they had a number of pre-specified endpoints, one of which was be like a 10-point reduction on your CAPS-5 score. Another one would be achieving a score on that scale of less than 10, meaning that they had basically lost their diagnosis of PTSD, or that they went into what was called a remission, which means a significant reduction in their score plus loss of diagnosis. So, basically a complete response. And so they ran this study, and they enrolled 91 participants in the end. They were aiming for a little bit higher, but then COVID-19 came about, so they had difficulty with enrollment. So they were left with 91. Roughly half of them were randomized to each group, and 42 out of the 46 and 37 out of the 44 in the placebo group, respectively, completed the trial and were the basis for this analysis. And the results were really impressive. There was an effect size of 0.91 in terms of a reduction on this CAPS-5 score. And to put that in perspective, though this is not a comparison directly against the SSRIs, in the SSRI trials, we were looking at an effect size of around 0.3, 0.4, maybe 0.5 at best. So this was roughly double or maybe triple what had been experienced in the Paxil trials in the past. So a really sort of striking result. And, I thought the methodology behind the study with the blinding, at the end they did an assessment to see how many of the patients thought that they were receiving the placebo versus the active. And interestingly, they really, a lot of those who were receiving the ecstasy thought they were receiving the ecstasy, which is maybe not surprising because its effects are extremely potent. And so you probably would notice that you were taking this drug. And so in that sense, the blinding was probably not very effective since it was kind of obvious what drug you were receiving after you'd had a dose. Nonetheless, I thought overall the mechanics of how the trial was executed were very crisp and precise, and the data they presented were impressive in terms of effect size. And I came away thinking that this is probably a game changer for the field.
Yeah, thanks for that summary, Don. Do you share Chris's feelings? What was your take on the study?
Yeah, no, I agree. I thought it was a really well constructed study. I thought the way they approached things was really solid, and the way they set it up was really solid, as was the analysis, and the findings were as pronounced as Chris is mentioning. Although I had a couple of issues, and one of them was the blinding. Mm-hmm. And this is a very popular club drug. This is a drug that a few years ago, there were some real problems with because, kids were going to raves, taking this drug, and it has a propensity to cause dehydration. And there were kids that were being sent to the emergency room because they got massively dehydrated in the middle of this hot, steamy, rave or dance that they were going to. So it's a very commonly known drug, at least in that population. And I think one of the effects of this drug is that you get huge dilatation of the pupils. And in addition to having a psychotropic drug, there's just no question when you look in the mirror that you are part of the active ingredient arm. So I can't believe that anybody that was in that arm actually didn't know or suspect that they were in it. And they were told when they were being evaluated by these evaluators who themselves were blinded, the subjects were told, don't let on as to whether you think you are in the active group or not. And it was dependent upon the participant to maintain that blinding in the setting of getting these 3 evaluations. And I thought that was a little dodgy, and I can see how that could have introduced all sorts of bias. That's one thing. The other thing that I thought was interesting, when you look at the figure and you look at the relapse rate, so the comparison of the placebo, which is behavioral therapy and a sugar pill, versus behavioral therapy and MDMA, there was a pronounced effect with the MDMA in the first couple of evaluations. But when you look at the final evaluation, there was a real relapse in the MDMA group, a substantial relapse. And they never mentioned it anywhere that I could see in the introduction or in the method section, or in the results section or in the discussion. And I thought that that was a little dodgy and a little worrisome. And I think that, it's very intriguing, but more work needs to be done. And we need to really follow this out much, much longer to see whether, in fact, all the benefit is, in fact, early and, it's, overshadowed by a late relapse.
One of the narratives that accompanied this was that, we have to remember that this is a drug to augment the effectiveness of therapy, the sort of inward-looking, like how do you process your emotions, how do you reduce the fight and flight response, how do you manage your fear, as opposed to being just a study of the drug itself. And technically that's true because both groups got the therapeutic, as sort of the backbone. But it's really, interesting to speculate what would be the effect of the drug by itself without doing the therapy, which would be obviously logistically far easier to do. Or does it really depend on taking the medication and then going through this therapeutic intervention, and it is the medication that augments the therapy? But does the medicine itself stand alone, or is it really just a way of facilitating the effectiveness of therapy? So I hope that's a question that they will chase in the future, because it seems to could be a very important next question to answer.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm sort of agreeing with both of you in that I think that there is something intriguing going on here. The size of the effects that they observed, Chris, it was helpful for me to have you walk through the comparison to the antidepressant drugs, because it looked to me like this is an impressive effect size, but I had nothing to benchmark it to. So this really does, appear to be a large benefit. Now, temper that a bit with the fact that it's a small study, and small studies almost always overestimate effect sizes when they find them, and also temper that a little bit with the fact that it was a small study and there were fair amount of baseline imbalances, which you'd expect, and they're certainly accounted for in your your assessment of random error, but you might want to think about whether or not those imbalances in any way contribute to the effect size. That said, there does appear to me like there's something going on, and I think that is really promising and exciting, and I'd want to see a lot more information before I'd be willing to take this at as is. But I share Don's concern about the blinding. So to put an actual number to it, they say at the time of study unblinding, it became apparent that at least 10% had inaccurately guessed their treatment arm. So 10% didn't know which treatment arm they're in. Well,
90% did.
90% did.
It was a weird way. It was a weird way to phrase it, I thought.
Yeah.
If it's a 50-50 guess, then you'd expect if nobody knew what was going on, 50% of them would get it right. It turned out 90% of them got it right. So
MDMA is not subtle in the least.
No.
No.
Now the question is, does it matter? Because, if part of the therapy, if part of the benefit is just simply knowing that you're getting the drug and it makes you feel better, does it matter? Well, I think the answer to that goes to the point that Don raised, which is that if there is substantial amount of relapse, then the answer is probably it does matter. It isn't, we can't count on this to necessarily be an effect of the drug as much as it is an effect of knowing that you're getting the drug. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying you need a lot more evidence to convince me. And, I'm not there yet, but I thought it was really promising.
Mm-hmm.
One of the other things that I noted was that they talk about sort of stratification of the severity of PTSD, and the worser cases, the more bad cases of PTSD are associated with these comorbidities. One of which is something called dissociative syndrome, where you feel like you've got an out of body experience, or substance abuse disorder, and how in the description of the results, though it wasn't their main finding, they indicated that there was, in particular, an effect seen with these more severe types of PTSD. But they don't mention the fact, and it's buried deep in the method section, that the presence of these comorbidities were an exclusion criteria. So my question was, are they stacking the deck? Maybe against themselves, because they're excluding the more severe cases of PTSD from enrollment in the study, but they nonetheless find an effect amongst that more severe group of PTSD sufferers who might be considered to be a little bit more recalcitrant in terms of an effect. I thought that was interesting, and they didn't really mention it in the discussion. I thought that would have been helpful to have that fleshed out some.
So there are a lot of unanswered questions here, and I suppose an important one is, in the same way that the effects of ketamine for major depression seem to be rather transient. They're potent, but they last 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and then you have to go and have another ketamine administration. One wonders, is there sort of a more permanent neurological lesion that underlies PTSD that is ameliorated by the exposure to MDMA, but would not be, after some time will reassert itself. And so I would love to see like the durability of the effect studied in these patients. And maybe they're planning a follow-up analysis to see, how do these individuals in the two groups fare over time, not just in the 18-week post-randomization window.
Although, Chris, I'm certainly not up on the ketamine literature, but my understanding was that ketamine may take several courses to kick in, but for some portion, whether it's small or medium or large, some portion actually do have a prolonged effect against depression with ketamine. So I agree. We're sort of on the cusp of this incredibly exciting new area of investigation for this whole class of drugs that have been pariahs for our whole lives, and now they're being seriously considered, and the FDA is taking a serious look and allowing researchers like these guys to do really good work, and we will get an answer. And it'll be a really important answer, both for depression and PTSD, which are really, really important mental health problems.
And I have to say that the sort of following that thread, there's a whole world of research opening up around the therapeutic use of medical marijuana, like not medical marijuana in sort of a loose sense, but like specifically targeting diseases, doing proper randomized controlled trials with proper blinding and follow up and all of those things to see, what are the potential therapeutic uses of cannabis. And so I think all of this is like suddenly shifting and becoming open game for serious investigation.
Yeah, LSD and psilocybin too.
Yeah.
Yep. I thought the other thing I thought was interesting about this study was because it's a controlled substance and because the study was done during COVID times, there were a lot of sort of challenges to actually getting this study done. So they had to get special approval. They had to get FDA breakthrough therapy designation. Then they had to figure out the dosing to use. And interestingly enough, they say, although low-dose MDMA improved blinding in phase 2 studies, it led to a decreased effectiveness compared to the inactive placebo, making it easier to detect a difference, which is really interesting because basically what they're saying is people couldn't tell what drug they were on if you used low dose, and it was less effective. Therefore, we had to up the dose. Well, that could be because you need a bigger dose for it to be effective, but it could also be that
the placebo effect was attenuated.
That knowing which drug you were getting led to the benefit. They did live video interviews. The independent raters did following each experimental session to try and sort of help with the blinding. They then had to shift to televisits during the COVID era, which I thought was pretty cool. And then they anticipated the effects of MDA, such as euphoria, stimulation, and feelings of closeness. So they specifically didn't ask about those things as adverse events in order to prevent unblinding the raters. But as Don, you said, you have skepticism as to whether or not that would actually work and be effective. Just sort of all kinds of interesting pieces to this.
Right, because it would be very hard to not start a therapy session by saying, how are you feeling right now?
Yeah.
And you're really like, I feel awesome. you want to dance for 12 hours,
And wasn't the first therapy session, wasn't it conducted with a therapist as the person was coming on to the medication, and it was an
Absolutely.
8-hour therapy session?
Right,
So
right.
it
So
was
they were totally intoxicated while they were going through these sessions.
sort of a trip advisor.
Yeah. Yeah. And nonetheless, all these things notwithstanding, I thought this was just a fascinating piece of science.
Yeah, I do too.
So.
I mean, I think there are a lot of unanswered questions, but I thought this was a really nice piece of work and a good first step.
Yeah,
indeed. Good on them. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to mention, which was sort of curious, I was trying to figure out who the funder was. And I couldn't actually find that information in the paper. I don't know if you dug around in the fine print and maybe I just went past it. But one of the organizations that was responsible for designing this in collaboration with FDA was a group that studies it's called the MAPS Coalition, and I can't find the definition of the acronym right now, but it's a group that studies the use of psychedelics for psychiatric illnesses.
Yeah, I didn't pick up on that about the funder, but I did read the list of disclosures, which are extensive, but I didn't find anything very interesting in them.
Yeah, so here it is. It's MAPS stands for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies.
Yeah.
Where they got their funding to do this, I don't know, but
maybe from the tie-dye industry
or the pizza or ice cream industry.
All right, let's move on to our second segment where we're going to talk about whether vaccine passports are legal and ethical, at least in the United States, although they do talk about internationally. And this is motivated by a Viewpoint paper in JAMA by first author Glenn Cohen entitled Digital Health Passes in the Age of COVID-19. Are Vaccine Passports Lawful and Ethical?
I think the answer is yes.
Yeah. So this, I have to admit,
We're biased.
I was a little fair enough. I was a little surprised by this though, because I'm sure for people who are well steeped in this, in the law, this is not all that surprising. But as somebody who's not, I was not totally sure they would be considered to be legal. I mean, ethical is another issue, but legal in the United States. And so I was curious to read this because to see what the arguments were. So digital health passports, essentially a digital record of your proof of vaccination. They make the case they would offer a lot of economic benefits until we get to the point of herd immunity, because you could control how you reopen the economy. And, while some people may be against them, it may help stimulate the economy, because if consumers knew that, say, a restaurant was going to require a digital health passport for coming into the premises, then they may be more likely to want to go to that restaurant because they might feel safer. So the article then talks about some of the scientific challenges to digital health passports, which I don't have a lot of interest in talking through. But what I thought was interesting is the question of, are they both lawful and ethical? And the answer to the lawful question seems to be yes, both domestically and sort of here in the United States, but also according to international law. So those of us who travel, to internationally know that you often are required to travel with your World Health Organization card, documenting your vaccination, or can be subject to being required to get a, say, for example, yellow fever vaccination at the border in some cases. And this is all codified into international law. So the international health regulations signed by 196 countries grant discretion to exercise evidence-based public health powers, and Article 31 specifically allows governments to require proof of vaccination. In the United States, it's states that hold the power to require this, and as we know, states already condition school entry. In most states, I think all states, condition school entry on vaccination status. So this is clearly, long-standing precedent for this. The article then goes through some of the potentials where you might be concerned that you would be violating U.S. law. So it's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has issued guidance on SARS-CoV-2 vaccinations, which apply to any vaccine, which has been approved by the FDA and also seems to also apply to experimental ones that have been given emergency use authorization. And they do not put any restrictions on the use of a digital health passport. Employers could use them, and requiring the vaccination doesn't violate the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And employers using them probably also doesn't violate HIPAA, because employers are not typically covered entities under HIPAA. So it seems like these would be perfectly legal to use in the United States. The question then becomes, are they ethical? So let me just stop there and ask you guys what you think. I mean, is this something we should be doing?
Perfectly legal in the United States as determined by the state legislatures. And as we are seeing in the United States, the state legislatures in a number of states are beginning to pass laws that are not necessarily consistent with the scientific evidence. So that leaves me a little uneasy that, in fact, a rogue Republican legislature could establish the law of that state's land as being absolutely not required. So, I would rather see it be a law or a set of circumstances that were set at the national level. But from this article and from sort of the little bit that we know as non-lawyers and as non-legislators, the only way the federal government can have any oversight over that is if it in some way affects interstate traffic, interstate commerce. So I don't know that we'll ever have a federal solution to this. It'll be a state by state solution. I think there's a really interesting example that occurred in California when they provided belief exceptions to vaccination in terms of going into school, and the number of belief exceptions that were being requested and granted went way up. And then there was a referendum in California, and they said basically belief exceptions are no longer available, but medical exceptions are. And then the number of medical exceptions went way, way up, and people were trying to get medical exceptions for non-vaccination of their children from neurologists, brain surgeons, and eye doctors, physicians whose training makes them not necessarily qualified to be able to make those decisions. So there's a tremendous groundswell of resistance that, in my experience, has just been getting worse and worse and worse. And over the last 12 months has become completely jump-started by COVID. And it's much worse than it has ever been.
Well, I guess I would say that an individual has a right to not be vaccinated if they so choose. And, that's their decision. But that is separate from their right to expose other people to COVID-19. That concern is becoming less and less important as more and more people have been vaccinated. And so, now that I've been vaccinated, I don't particularly care if anybody exposes me because I believe the science and I'm very confident the vaccine will prevent me. So I don't really care if someone exposes me to COVID-19 anymore because I don't think anything will happen from it. But not everybody's been vaccinated and not everybody can respond to the vaccine. And so there still remains an ethical, mandate that people prioritize the health of the people around them beyond their own health. If you are making a health decision that only affects you, that's your decision. But if you're making a health decision that affects the people around you in your network, then it is no longer about you. It is about now, because the whole field of ethics is not about, making decisions for you as if you were an island. The whole field of ethics is about human interaction. And I think in that sense, it is clearly ethical to require that we protect each other. Right? If it is not a decision that only impacts you, but affects the herd, then it is, your personal right becomes subordinate to this greater need to protect, the rest of society. So I think the ethical criterion is very clearly met here. And, again, we're not requiring people to get vaccinated. We're just saying that if you don't want to get vaccinated, you do not have a God-given right to go to Chick-fil-A.
Yeah, to go back to Don's point about these being, state legislatures essentially having the authority, and could we have a federal law? I agree with you completely, Don. There's no chance of that happening because our government is so divided right now. Getting anything through the Senate would be presumably impossible, and so this is always going to fall to being a state issue, and I suspect that you are going to see different states making different decisions on this. And, you wonder what the consequences of that are going to be. I don't know.
Yeah, picking up on Chris's point, I think it's really important for it to be recognized that I think that the state's ability to mandate vaccination in everybody has limits. And I think we all would agree that it should have limits in terms of what the state can demand that you can do. But the state can, and when I say the state, I mean either the federal or the state governments. But you choose to participate in a mandate like vaccination to enjoy the privileges of society. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to withdraw the privileges of participation in society, like going to school, getting a free public education, or, riding on public transportation, things like that. And I have no ethical issue with withholding those privileges for those people who are putting the rest of the or the most highly vulnerable part of the population at risk. Like Chris said, people who have, it's now being shown that people who have cancer, people who are taking DMARDs for autoimmune disease, or people who are on, who are immunosuppressed because they have lymphoma and are on chemotherapy, even if they get vaccinated, they're not responding. So they remain unprotected, and they are the people who we, as a community, need to protect if we are a civilized society.
Yep.
Well said.
So one additional point that I thought was interesting is that the ethics of this, or at least the equity, if you put those two together, are affected by the timing of when any kind of a digital health passport would be required. Because if you were to institute a digital health passport now, you would potentially unfairly exclude those who can't access the vaccine. So you've got to wait until the point at which there is access for everyone, which, in the United States, we're pretty close to there. We're not there yet, but we're pretty close to there. But, if you were to institute these for international travel, which, a lot of places are considering doing, then you're going to allow travel by, those countries who have been able to access all of the vaccine supply, and not folks in countries where they can't. And that represents a potential ethical conundrum right there. So it seems like there's, I would agree with you both. I don't think there is an overriding ethical concern, but there are these sort of smaller issues that do come up that I think need to get sorted out in order for this to be able to work on a global scale.
Yeah. There was one other thing that I thought was interesting in this paper, which concerns like the use of the phrase "the vaccine." Right? So we hear that all the time. Did you get the vaccine? But there isn't a vaccine. There is no the vaccine. There are 3 vaccines. And while the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine appear to be incredibly effective and almost, I think, interchangeable in their performance, that is not true for the Johnson & Johnson single-shot vaccine, nor for the AstraZeneca vaccine, which is not relevant so much in the United States. But nonetheless, these vaccines are not equivalent. So when we say you have received the vaccine, we're treating them as if they're all completely interchangeable, even though that is probably not true. I think actually not probably not true. It is not true. So, that is another sort of subtlety to this debate that I think, has been really not discussed, because we would like to view it in a much simpler way of saying they're all the same. But that will not be the truth, in 6 to 10 months, when we start to see that, some of these vaccines are losing efficacy over time, as vaccines do. And then the question comes, can these vaccines all boost? Can you update your immunocompetence, your immune status by taking a booster dose? And the jury is out as to whether the Johnson & Johnson vaccine can be boosted.
Or we just don't know. Or any of them, actually, at this one. Yeah.
Yeah. Though I think the Pfizer and Moderna folks are sprinting down the track on this. A colleague of mine, when I was chatting with him the other day, mentioned casually that he had just received his 3rd dose of the Moderna vaccine, and the 3rd dose was the booster dose, which was a cocktail of the parent strain and the South Africa strain.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah.
So that's a trial?
Those data are coming. Yeah, those data are coming. It's actually part of the original, not the original trial, but it's part of the amended protocol. So it's the same phase 3 trial, but is now adapted and is including a booster evaluation as well, using several different combinations of the boosters, one of which is the parent strain combined with the South Africa strain, but there are others that are looking at the UK strain or just the parent strain alone.
Interesting. Any last thoughts before we move on? All right. So let's go on to our third segment, which is our amazing and amusing. And Don, I'm gonna let you go first this
Oh,
time.
really? How wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, you are
All right.
most welcome.
All right. So I read an absolutely fascinating viewpoint in JAMA, and I wanted to sort of start out my report of this by asking the question of you guys: why do we sleep?
Oh,
Not because we're tired. What is the physiologic function of sleep? I mean, sleep is something that all higher order animals do. And one would think that evolutionarily, it's not very adaptive. I mean,
yeah.
when you are asleep, you are highly vulnerable. So it must serve a really important function. What is the function of sleep?
Well,
Yeah.
obviously I don't know the answer to that question, and you're going to hopefully tell us. But didn't sort of the sleep evolve in animals that were able to burrow underground? Because that would be the first animal that could completely shut down and still feel safe.
No idea.
Whereas animals that couldn't, would sort of have to develop this sort of one eye, like fish have sleep with one eye open kind of thing. Yeah.
One idea. I don't know about that.
Mm.
I can't answer your question, though I accept the premise that it must be essential, otherwise we wouldn't do it. But there was a recent story I stumbled across when I was listening to the radio. It might have been Radiolab, actually, talking about this experiment that was done by a group of French sleep scientists who went into a cave, deep into a
Yeah.
cave, and spent 6 months living in the cave.
Yep, I heard
So
this.
with no sunlight exposure at all. And then they just sort of followed like what happened. And one of the most fascinating things of this is that people drifted off of the 24-hour circadian clock very quickly. And some, sort of naturally acquired a rhythm of less sleep, and some required more. But the average was that it drifted up to a 30-hour day. And that's where the majority of the participants in this sort of set themselves, implying that the 24-hour sleep cycle is itself an aberration that is disrupted by the rising of the sun each day.
But that doesn't inform us in terms of what is the function of sleep.
No.
Did
no.
you think we were going to answer your question?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I did.
Oh,
In any event, so
do you have a theory, Don?
well, this guy Anthony Komaroff does in this JAMA viewpoint, which just came out, and he points out the fact that there's been some prior research which seem to indicate that the unused synapses that occur over a long period of many days are pruned during sleep, and that might have something to do with it. But he talks more about despite the fact that for several centuries, science has looked for the presence of a central nervous system lymphatic system. And it's never been found. And the lymphatic system is a system that sort of takes the fluid that exudes out of the cells and courses its way between cells and then finds its way into these channels called the lymph channels, in which there are lymph nodes. And then eventually that intracellular, then extracellular fluid gets dumped back into the circulation, and that is the lymphatic circulation in the body outside of the central nervous system. And they were perplexed because they never were able to show that. But recent evidence in non-human primates, mice, and in humans indicates that they have discovered a central nervous system lymphatic system, and it is constructed as this sleeve around all of the arteries in the central nervous system. And that sleeve contains essentially small amounts of cerebrospinal fluid. And they now postulate that the function of this central nervous system, lymphatic system, is to take the toxins that are produced by the very metabolically active neurons and glia cells in the central nervous system, which produce these toxic substances like amyloid beta and tau, which need to be flushed out because they are toxic on the cells, and that their accumulation leads to Alzheimer's disease. And there has been a body of evidence to suggest that lack of sleep predisposes you later on in life to the development of Alzheimer's disease. And that they now are saying that this central nervous system, lymphatic system, is this waste management system for the brain, and that they have shown that the flow of what they are calling the glymphatic system is markedly increased during sleep. So during sleep, all of the toxins that are building up in these very metabolically active neural cells and glial cells make it out into the extracellular interstitial fluid or extracellular fluid, and then get sort of bathed by the cerebrospinal fluid and get pushed into the central nervous system, lymphatic system, and that then joins the regular lymphatic system that is found in the neck. So in essence,
Cool.
we sleep to take out the garbage, to take out the brain garbage.
That is really cool.
It was That's fascinating really cool. article. So I highly recommend it. It just came out in JAMA, and it's a viewpoint by Anthony Kamaroff.
Wow. Yeah. I will certainly want to read that. Thank you, Don. That sounds amazing.
Definitely going to read that one. Chris, what do you got?
Well, I had been receiving lots of enthusiastic endorsements of a Netflix movie called My Octopus Teacher.
Yeah.
Oh, I've heard about that.
Have you seen this?
I haven't seen it yet. But I really want to see it.
It is marvelous. So I will just describe it for you. We watched it as a family last week, and we were all just like crying at the end. It was so emotional. But it is a beautiful movie as well, and it concerns a South African. Basically, he's a videographer who studies wildlife, and he'd gone into a depression and a midlife crisis and just basically couldn't function. So he went back to his childhood home, which is on False Bay, south of Cape Town. Mm-hmm. If you've been there, and it's apparently a very beautiful place.
Yep.
And he started snorkeling in the kelp beds in this bay. And of course, the water's very cold, but he quickly adapted to that. And he started doing it every day. And one of these days when he was sort of snorkeling about, looking at interesting things and just marveling at the beauty of the place, he saw this strange looking thing, which is a whole bunch of mussel shells and other shells kind of arranged in a ball, with all the shells sort of pointing outward. And he was looking at this thing and he said, what the heck could that possibly be? And then all of a sudden, this thing transferred into an octopus and dropped all the mussel shells that it had been holding onto and then darted off. And I was like, oh my goodness, that is so, I've never seen anything like that. And so he followed it back to its den, because octopuses live in a kind of in a burrow and they usually surround themselves with shells. And he started swimming out to take a look at the octopus every day and spending as much time as he could with this octopus. And the movie is all about him spending essentially an entire year hanging out with the octopus in this kelp bed and learning about the octopus and eventually interacting with the octopus such that the octopus would come out and sort of hold hands with him. And at one point actually crawls up into his chest and basically hugs him, and sort of wraps himself around this guy. And they just sort of sit there with him sort of like patting the octopus like it's a giant kitten. And of course, it's got a sharp beak and it's venomous, so it could do him harm. But they had learned to trust each other and became interested in each other. And he studies its behavior and learns all sorts of things that were not known about octopuses, including its foraging and its cunning ways of capturing its prey, which were really ingenious. But also just the fact that this animal is so incredibly intelligent and interactive, and yet so ephemeral, because they only live about a year. And so they're solitary. So there's no imprinting. There's no learning from mother duck how to swim. They have to figure out everything by themselves through experimentation. But they're incredibly curious animals, and they're incredibly fast learners. And sadly, at the very end, it mates and has its clutch of eggs, and then octopuses die. They're like what we were talking about with cicadas. As soon as they've mated and they've raised their brood, they die and they sort of donate themselves to the ecosystem. And so he loses his friend. But it is a beautiful, beautiful movie, and I think you should go take a look at it. With the kids will love it.
Yeah, I've heard that.
The adults will love it too.
Heard that from a lot of people.
As have I. They're such fascinating creatures. Thanks for sharing that one, Chris. All right, well then I will end with the absurdity of peer review. So I was interested. I came across this. I don't know, what do you call Medium posts? You call them blog posts? I don't know what you call them.
I think it would be a blog post, yeah.
A Medium blog post called "The Absurdity of Peer Review: What the Pandemic Revealed About Scientific Publishing" by Mark Humphreys, and he makes an argument that essentially the pandemic has sort of pulled the curtain back and exposed us for peer review not really doing what it is intended to do, and demonstrating that peer review always was problematic, that we like to give it a lot of credit for being the system that allows us to weed out the good from the bad, when in fact we, as we know in this podcast, bad stuff gets through all the time and good stuff can be treated very, very poorly. None of that, of course, is new news to any of our listeners because we talk about that quite a bit. But there were sort of a couple of things that I thought were interesting in this article. The first is he talks a bit about Einstein's experience with peer review. I assume, do you guys know that history there?
No.
What happened?
So I did know about this. This is sort of fairly well known, but only one of Einstein's 300 plus papers, had ever been peer reviewed.
No.
And the one article was sent out for peer review and came back with comments and was sent back to him. And Einstein's reaction to that was, I never gave you permission to send out my manuscript to other people. I am done with your journal. And there's you can Google it. You can find
he
the
can get
letter.
away with
pull
that.
it off.
He can get away with that.
Well, so here's the thing about that. You're right. You're absolutely right about that. But, this sort of leads into a bit of the history of peer review, which I really didn't know. So peer reviews was started with the Royal Society starting to get anonymous reports in the 1830s for papers that they were publishing in Philosophical Transactions. But, it really wasn't used all that much until the 1970s, which is why only one of Einstein's paper was ever peer reviewed. And when it happened, he was appalled by this happening. So we think of it as a mainstay of the scientific publishing process, but it really, it wasn't until about 1973 that it starts to take off and become a central part of the publishing process that we know it now, which is interesting to me because, when you think of epidemiology as a field, I mean, the 1970s is really when epidemiology gets going as a field. I mean, obviously it existed well before that. And, sort of chronic disease epidemiology probably starts in the 50s and 60s, probably starts before that. But, smoking and lung cancer is sort of when it gets its big, a lot of the development. But the development of the field and the methods that are central to the field is really, occurring around the same time as this whole process. So, that just sort of was inherently interesting to me. But he then goes through and makes this argument that, we talk about peer review as being so great, but then why do we have the replication crisis in psychology if the peer review system is so great? Why do we have so many, COVID papers that end up getting retracted, et cetera, et cetera? That all led me to a Vox piece from 2015 called Let's Stop Pretending Peer Review Works. And that got me to an experiment that was done in the 1980s. I think Nick will know because Nick always remembers the history of everything. We may have actually alluded to this in an earlier episode, but I didn't really remember it, which I thought was just an interesting experiment done, peer reviews taking off in the 70s. This experiment was done in the 1980s with some skepticism that peer review really done anything. So two researchers from Cornell and the University of North Dakota decided that what they would do is to see if peer review was in fact effective, they would take 12 papers that had been published 2 to 3 years earlier in some selective American psychology journals, and then they would resubmit those exact same articles to the same journals with different author names. And what happened was nearly 90% of the peer reviewers of these papers found serious flaws and recommended against publishing them, often citing serious methodological flaws, suggesting, not too surprisingly, but that as we've experienced many times, that the peer review process can be a bit arbitrary. If you were to send a paper to 100 people instead of just 3, the consensus might be very different than what you get from only 3 or 2 people in some cases, sometimes even only 1. And so what, we experience in this with peer review of manuscripts, but we also experience it with grant reviews. You
Absolutely.
submit your grant to an NIH panel, and if it had gone to a different 3 people, might have gotten a very different score. And so to me, it just sort of points out that there are these challenges with the peer review system that we haven't solved yet. It's not, to the point where I want to throw out the peer review system, but it definitely points me to the fact that it is, it is one step. It is not the end all be all. And I think, we really do need to be thinking about how we improve the system. So,
and I think that the system has evolved to the point where it's under a lot more stress now than it was 5 or 10 years ago, because there are so many more journals that are seeking review. And I think there's, the number of potential reviewers is not expanding at the same rate. So I think that there's a real crisis in terms of finding quality peer reviewers.
Totally agree. Yep. A lot of work to be done there. Nothing of a surprise. I just thought there was some interesting history and tidbits there that were worth sharing. So that is the end of our program. If you've got any feedback on this or any other episode, or you want to suggest a study or a topic for us to take on, you can tweet us at PopHealthyX, or me at Prof. Matt Fox, or Don at DTheo1, or Chris at ID.Gill, or you can find us on the Population Health Exchange website at www.pophealthyx.org. We want to thank Leslie Talalian, Assistant Dean of Lifelong Learning at the BU School of Public Health, for supporting the podcast, and Nick Guler for sound editing and remembering everything that's ever been presented on the podcast in the past. Thanks for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we hope you will download our next episode.